Hello and welcome to Cooking with Love. I'm Linda Verasso, the chef owner of Peppercorns on Main on Route 18 in South Weymouth. Now, a few weeks ago, a very loyal customer and cooking class student, Fred Hickson, came to me and said, "Hey, how would you like to do a cooking show for the local cable channel?" And I thought, what a great idea. So not only is Fred a great cook in his own right, but he also said, I can shoot it, produce it, direct it, edit it. And I thought, well, how can I refuse that? So here we are. And first of all, I'd like to thank Fred for having such a great idea. I know we're going to have a lot of fun with these shows. Now, during these shows, I'm going to show you how to make all kinds of traditional as well as contemporary Italian dishes. And while I pride myself on being 100% Italian, we are going to visit some other countries as well, because there's wonderful food throughout the world to experience, and we're going to learn a little bit about that. And while every country is unique, and they all have their own unique flavors and ingredients and even methods of cooking, what I would put a lot of money on is the fact that you can find a grandmother in every single one of those countries that would tell you the same thing my grandmother's told me time and time again. And that's simply, when you cook, do it with love. You will most definitely taste the difference. So let's go make all those grandmothers proud. On this show, we're going to take some recipes right out of one of my grandmother's cookbooks. Now, this cookbook is something that my mother helped my grandmother make over the course of months and months. And as I'm sure you can imagine, grandmothers don't measure anything. Certainly mine didn't. So to make this work, what my mother had to do was a labor of love in itself. I mean, think about it. My grandmother's sitting here and she's got a bowl or a pan or something she's about to put something in. And she'll take her handful of something and she'll come over to that bowl or that pan, and over on top of the pan is my mother sitting there with a piece of wax paper ready to catch it. And what happened is she'd grab her handful, my grandmother would put it in as if she was going to, my mother would take that paper, she'd move over here, she'd pour it out, measure it, and that's how we got this cookbook. Now, for the dozens of recipes that are in here, that took quite a bit of time, but it worked. And in fact, now we have a recipe book that actually tastes like Gram made. And that year, we were all fortunate enough that 29 of her grandchildren received this book for Christmas. That was back in 1994, and as you can tell from looking at mine, it is well worn and tabbed, and it is something that every one of us treasures. And I can tell you, you couldn't give me $1 million for this book. Okay, well, maybe $1 million, but only because I have another copy. But seriously, it is a priceless book, and it is one that I use all of the time. And today, we're actually going to take 3 recipes right from it. And we're going to do my Graham Campo's spaghetti meat sauce. We're going to make her meatballs and her ricotta gnocchis. Now, you can't get more traditional than that. And as we go through each of these recipes, and as I show you different things, I will try to teach you some techniques or methods that I might be using at the time so that you may become better in the kitchen. And additionally, one of the things I love about the culinary arts is how much folklore and history there is to foods and ingredients and all of those things. And I have looked up a lot of that stuff as I've done many of my cooking classes. And today, when it makes sense, I'm going to pause and probably share a bit of that information with you too. So you can go and impress all your friends with your culinary expertise. So let's get in the kitchen and get started. Okay, so the first thing you need to know when you're making a sauce is to make sure that you're using the right pan. What we're using here is a couple of gallons worth of pan here, but the important thing is that the bottom is a thick bottom. It's a reinforced bottom. If you use a really thin one, chances are you're going to burn the sauce. When you're cooking anything that you're going to cook for some time, even over a low heat, your best bet is to have a thicker bottom. So that's what we're going to use here. Other than that, it's really just a matter of putting all the ingredients in and letting them cook. And as you can tell from the recipe, you see that we will have a little bit of oil and sausages we use in the sauce, tomatoes, some spices, and then later on we'll add the meatballs to it. But to get started, we start with the pork, because the pork does take a little longer to cook than the meatballs do in the sauce in total. So we start with a couple tablespoons of oil that we're going to put in our pan there. We're going to put that at about a medium heat or so to begin. And we want to get the sauce a little warm before we put the sausages in. And the reason is that will help them from sticking. So what we have here, we're starting with about 4 just regular Italian sweet pork sausages. You can actually use any kind of pork you want to, or really any kind of meat you want to. But if you're going with my grandmother's recipe, then she uses either like a pork neck bone or the Italian sausages. And today we're using the sausages. So once we've got this oil, it's getting a little warm here, we're going to put our sausages right in. And I don't know if you can hear that, but it's starting to sizzle just a bit, which is what we want it to do. Really, we're not looking to cook these sausages completely. What we're looking to do is to simply brown them on the different sides. Now, outside of that, while those are browning, let me tell you a little bit about the tomatoes. Now, you can use many different kinds of tomatoes, and really it's a preference in the type you want. And what I mean by that, let me turn these, they're sizzling pretty loudly, is that they have tomatoes, as you know, coming in whole. They have them in ground, they have them in crushed, they have them pureed. However you like. If you like chunks in your sauce, then obviously you're going to use a crushed or a ground tomato. Personally, when I grew up, my mother didn't like chunks at all, which I found out later, which is why she blended them, and my grandmother blended them before we used them. So as you can see here, I've already taken this can and blended them, and that's what we're going to use in our sauce today. So we're going to let these, flip these one more time. They're getting brown. It does not take very long. All right, those look pretty good. And what I'm going to do now is add a little bit of garlic and turn it down just a touch. I'm going to add some chopped garlic. Move that around a little bit. And this is when we add our tomato. Again, I just ground these a little while ago in the blender for just a few seconds to make them nice and smooth. We're going to put that right in our pan. And so that we get all this goodness out, I have filled this can with water. And I'm going to pour it right back into here to kind of mix all that around and get all the juices out so we don't waste it. As we're pouring that in, we're going to mix that around so we get it off the edges. Other than that, of course, you always need a little salt and pepper. And we have some dried basil and dried parsley. We use dried because it's going to cook for a while. If you want to use a fresh herbs, you're welcome to do that, but there's 2 rules there. Number 1 is if you're using fresh instead of dried, make sure you use twice as much. So you would use, for instance, 2 tablespoons of a fresh herb compared to 1 tablespoon of a dried. And the reason is the dried concentrates its flavors as it dries, and you therefore need less. But in doing so, because they're more concentrated, the dried herbs work better in something that you're going to cook over a long period of time. So that's why we're going to use the dried here. However, if you want to use the fresh, you can do it. But rule number 2 there is to put it in very close to the end of cooking. If you put them in too early on, they're going to lose the flavors that you're looking to get in your sauce. So, safe bet, use dried for sauce anyway. So in goes parsley and basil. We have our salt, pepper, garlic, parsley, basil, everything's in there now. We're just going to give that a stir. And what you'll notice is I haven't touched the tomato paste yet. And I haven't done that on purpose. And that's because you put that in probably in about 10-15 minutes after the sauce and everything we just put in has a chance to get hot. As it warms up, when we put the tomato paste in, it'll melt it much more nicely, and then we'll be off to a great sauce. Okay, so the sauce has been cooking and it's actually simmering quite nicely. You don't want it to be too heavy, or too fast, I should say. Just like a nice, even, slow simmer will cook this best. But it's now nice and hot, so what I'm going to do, as I mentioned, is you're going to wait a little while before you put the paste in, so it melts nicely. Again, I'm using just a little 6-ounce can of paste. And you generally will use 1 can per can of tomatoes. So I'm going to take that and pour it right in, or spoon it right in is more like it. Get all of the goodness out of it. Put that over there, and I'm just going to stir that up so it melts into the sauce. And when I do that, one of the things the paste does is actually help to thicken the sauce. What I'm going to do is add a little more water, because I want this to cook for a while. And as it cooks, it's going to reduce. And you don't want it to reduce too much before it's fully cooked, because then it gets very thick and it'll burn on you. So every 15 minutes or so, you should take a look, add a little bit of water, which I'm going to do right now, just maybe a cup at a time. And certainly you want to add a little when you add the paste to it. So just stir it up, and it will do exactly what it needs to do, and we'll just let it keep cooking. Okay, so as I'm sure you can imagine, you really can't have meat sauce unless you have meatballs. So this is my grandmother's recipe, one I'm sharing with you out of the goodness of my heart. And it is actually pretty straightforward. I'm sure most folks have all of these ingredients in their meatball recipes. And it really is a little bit about how much love you put into it. And as you know, we do that well. So the first thing we're going to do is take our breadcrumbs. And when I was growing up, and actually still to this day, my mom will use a hard bread that she would put into water and soak it, and then crumble that bread after, squeeze it dry, then crumble it up and use that instead of breadcrumbs. My grandmother did it the same way. I think probably her grandmothers and mothers did it the same way as well. When you do that, you tend to end up with a softer meatball. In terms of ease of use, I'm going to go ahead and use breadcrumbs, which you can too. And I'm going to start by putting the breadcrumbs just in my pan. But to get that same softness, or at least a little closer, we're not going to go with just plain breadcrumbs. I'm going to add a little water to them. And that helps moisten the breadcrumbs and therefore soften the meatballs a bit. And all we're doing is we're just going to mix that breadcrumb around just to moisten them. And it's kind of a way of cheating on the more difficult step of wetting bread and squeezing it dry and crumbling it up. So now we have our moistened breadcrumbs, and what we're going to add to that is our burger. Now some people do use pork as well, or veal, or other types of ground meat in their meatballs. We're purists. I use ground beef. Preferred to use an 85-15 ground beef. What that means is there is 15% fat, 85% lean. If you can't find an 85-15, you can use an 80-20 as well. But we're going to put a pound of beef right here in with those breadcrumbs. And this is a simple recipe. You just add everything in and then you mix them up. So to that, we're going to add a little chopped garlic. We're adding some salt and pepper. We're adding basil and parsley, because you can't have anything in Italian cooking without basil and parsley. We're going to add some Romano cheese. It's about 3/4 of a cup of Romano cheese going right in. And then to bind it all together, you need some sort of binder. And in this case, between the breadcrumbs and the ever-important eggs, that's what's going in here. So your recipe that you'll see, if you haven't already, says 2 or 3 eggs. That is going to be something that you get to decide. And what I mean by that is I would start with 2. If the mixture seems a little hard, add that 3rd egg. If not, then go with what you have. And sometimes that's a function of how big your eggs are. If you're using just medium eggs, chances are you're going to need 3. If you're using large, extra large, jumbo, chances are you'll have 2 will be sufficient for it. Okay? All right, so all of our ingredients are in our pan. As you can tell, I'm putting gloves on. You don't have to do this at home, but I'm so used to working with gloves at the restaurant that I prefer it now. So I'm going to put on my gloves because really there's no better way to mix meatballs than with your hands. You could try a spoon. I wouldn't bother with a mixer. Your good old hands is really the best way to go. So I'm just going to dig in here and kind of break the eggs up as I'm doing it. As you can see, I'm just starting it by squishing it all through my fingers there to mix it around. Bring it all in together. I'm close, gonna come back in and get some help with the other hand. And really, you're just looking for a consistent color throughout, which then will mean that the breadcrumbs have been distributed pretty easily, or evenly, I should say, and the cheese has been distributed evenly, etc. And that's really all you're looking for. So, okay, so we're just about there. It feels pretty good. It's not too wet. You know, I don't know if you can tell from looking, but it's not too wet. I do think when we start rolling them, it is going to be a nice roll. It'll end up being nice and tight, and exactly what we're looking for in order for these to not fall apart in our sauce. Okay, there we go. So we have our meatball mix, and now it's time to get rolling. Okay, so now that we have our meatball mixture all made, what we're going to do is a couple of more steps. One is to actually roll them, and the other, of course, is to fry them and get them into our sauce. But let's start by rolling them. Now, when you roll them, some people like really big meatballs, some people like smaller ones. You know, usually you do what you grew up with. And for me, I grew up with meatballs that were a little on the smaller side. So that's how I'm going to do them. But again, this is completely up to you. This is the beauty about cooking. There's no wrong way to do it. If you want to make one big meatball, then have at it. You probably just need a bigger saucepan. So anyway, what I do, at least in the restaurant, is to make sure that they're as close to the same size as possible. And one way to get that happening is to use a scoop to start yourself off. So basically all I take is I've got an ounce scoop here, and I'm just going to take it and I'm going to just make a few balls of the meatball mixture and just put them aside. And we're going to do that first. We do need to continue though. We do need to roll them, and that is actually the critical part, which I'll show you in a minute. So let's start with these. As you can see, we have 5 pieces of meat here that we're going to roll up. And the rolling is probably the most important part. If you don't roll them tightly enough, what's going to happen is that they're going to fall apart in your sauce. And all you're going to end up with is a meat sauce instead of sauce with meatballs. So the way that I learned and the way that I do it is I take each one of these and I put it in my hand. And the first thing you do is you squish that down with a lot of pressure. You can tell that is gone now. That is no longer a ball of meat, that's a little patty. And then what you do is you slowly move your hands around in a circle. And as you're doing that, you slightly ease up on the pressure. And eventually, you're going to end up with a very tightly mixed meatball that will hold up to frying and will hold up in your sauce. So let me do another one for you. So there you go. We're going to take one, and as I said, you just press that right down. Get a lot of pressure on that, which helps all that meat and the eggs and cheese to all combine nicely. I'm moving it slowly, and I'm going to slightly ease up on the pressure. And as I do that, a very tight meatball will be created and we'll be good to go. And that's how we do each of the meatballs. Now we got a bunch of these to roll, so I'm going to do that now, and then I'll show you how we fry them. Okay, so now we're going to fry the meatballs. As you can see, I finished rolling them all, applying that pressure every time so they stay nice and round. And there's a couple things you want to make sure you do when you're frying them. Number one is to make sure you have enough oil in the pan. It should be pretty generous. in terms of the amount of oil. Very much a cover of the bottom, up maybe an eighth of an inch, quarter of an inch or so. And the second thing is to make sure that oil is very hot, because the oil, if it's not hot, your meatballs will tend to stick. That's actually true for just about anything you fry, by the way. If you want to have something not stick, make sure you start with hot oil. And then the third thing about making sure things don't stick is to make sure you're patient. So first thing we're going to do, we're going to place all these meatballs right in. And they're immediately starting to sizzle, which tells you that the oil is a good temperature. And we're going to put them all in, just all around. This is a pan that will hold all of them. You may have to do it in a couple batches, and that's perfectly okay. You just do whatever you got. Don't go buy anything new just to do this. And once these are in, you're actually not cooking these all the way through. We're only browning all the sides. What that's going to do for us is to gives them a little more protection, if you will, from falling apart as we stir the sauce. It also gives it very good flavor from the oil and the searing of the meat, and that all contributes to the taste of the sauce when we're done. So as I said, what we're going to do is make sure that we get each side browned. I like to use a fork to flip them, and you've got to be careful with them. Don't flip them too early. When you start going into the pan to flip them, if they are not loosened already, so in other words, don't dig underneath them and try to get them loose, they will loosen themselves up as they caramelize and as they brown on the side. And if they aren't ready, then don't flip them. If you start flipping them before they're ready, you're going to have a lot of crushed meatballs, which is, of course, not what we're trying to do here. So I'm just going to test a couple of these. They seem to be pretty good. They're not sticking, again, because of the hot oil. And I'm moving them around a bit, and the ones I put in first, I'm just going to take and flip over. And it doesn't take too long with the fork, just one flip, and you'll be able to see how brown these are getting. But again, there's certainly not enough time for these to cook all the way through. So I'm going to flip the rest of these and let these cook here. And once they're done, we're going to put them right into our sauce over here, which is bubbling nicely and waiting for them. And see, that one's not quite ready. Don't want to force it. We'll just move on to the next. Now, as you remember, we used a pound of meat in there. And of these 1 ounce size balls, I probably got about 20 of them. So if you're trying to figure out how many your family needs, I think you'll get about 20, 25 to a pound, depending on how big you make them. These, as I said, are about 1 ounce. Okay, so here we go. By the time I flip them all over, the first ones are ready to go in the sauce. I don't know if you can see the nice color on each of these. Make sure all the sides, sometimes you got to flip them onto their side if it didn't quite get all of it. And again, what we're trying to do here is protect them and to bring the flavor out of the meat and right into that sauce. Okay, so some of these are ready to go in. All I do with the sauce right next to me, take my fork, let's get it in there. We're just going to put them right on in the sauce. They will continue to cook, obviously, in the sauce, and they'll finish cooking there. Right now, they're still very raw. They just have a nice caramelization and coating all around them. once these are in, I'll finish putting these in, and then what we're going to do is we're going to move over and show you how we get to the gnocchis. Now when you're putting these in your sauce, you want to be careful not to crush them, move them all around the pan. And the last thing you'll do before you step away from the stove is to give them a stir so they're all submerged into the sauce. And when you do that, just be very careful again. You want to stir from the bottom, not around like that. Come down from the bottom, and that will help from ruining or breaking up anything that you might have in your sauce. Remember, we have the sausages in here too, so there's a lot of stuff in this sauce pot here that we've got to take care of. Shut this off so it doesn't burn the oil. Move that on over, and we got our last couple going in. Okay. There we go, we put that aside. As I said, you want to take around the side and come up from the bottom. Just stir in. And we're just going to leave that on very low, turn that down just a bit. And that'll cook for another, probably 30 minutes to an hour or so. And then we'll be ready to go. Okay, so now on to the gnocchis. Now, I call them gnocchis. A lot of people call them gnocchis. I've heard all kinds of things in the restaurant, but I'm going to go with gnocchis for now. So, what we make them with is ricotta cheese. We don't use potatoes, which is very traditional. In fact, the way that they first were made was with potatoes. And when I was growing up, we most of the time had potato gnocchis. Except when ricotta was on sale. And then we would be lucky enough that my grandmother would make the ricotta gnocchis, which in my opinion are superior in texture and in taste, although the other ones you can't complain about either. But here at the restaurant, we all use all ricotta, and we start with 2 pounds of just whole milk ricotta cheese, which I have here in my mixer. To that, we're going to add some flour and some salt, and that's it. It is one of the easiest things to make. People get very nervous about making pasta, but in this case, it's about as easy as you can get. If you were making potato gnocchis, however, the process is a lot more involved. There's usually some eggs and things like that involved. In the ricotta cheese ones, you don't need to do that. So, here we have the 2 pounds of ricotta in our mixer. I'm going to add to that 4 cups of flour, if I can. Probably should have done that a little differently. Let's move that on over. There we go. And of course, I'm going to get it everywhere just like you are at home, so don't worry about that. I'm going to lift up my mixer. I'm going to add some salt to that, and then I'm going to slowly turn it on and get it mixing. You want to go slow because if you don't, you've all done it before, I'm quite sure. You got flour everywhere, and then cleanup takes you longer than it actually does to make them. So we're just moving that around. As it starts to come together, you can increase the speed a bit, but you want to wait until most of that flour has some kind of moisture on it from the cheese. And there we go. We're going to give it a little bit more speed here. All we're looking for here is for it to form into a ball. After we do that, when we have the ball, which I'm going to show you in just a second because it doesn't take long, then I'll move on to showing you how to roll them, which is a 3-step process and probably the toughest one to do. Now you can see from the top of the mixer, that's all coming together now. I'm going to give it just a little more speed. And hold on just in case. Every once in a while it pops off because the dough can be firm. All right, now I'm going to stop that and push that dough down. And we're just going to let it knead a little bit more. And we'll pour it out onto the table and you'll see how that is. All right, that should do it. That's gotten it all mixed up pretty well. And take off our dough hook so we can get it out of the pan. There we go. Lift it up. Move this aside. And what you're left here is just a ball of gnocchi dough. And what you want to do is just take that and kind of press it all together. Give it a last little kneading by hand. And now you're ready to start splitting that up. And next I'm going to show you how we take this ball and transform it into those beautiful little bites of gnocchi we have. Okay, so now we go on to the next part about making gnocchis, which is arguably the most important and probably the one that takes a little bit of time to get used to. It's just a little practice like anything else in life, so don't worry too much about it. All you need, though, are your hands, the dough, just a bit of extra flour, which you may or may not use, and a knife. It doesn't have to be a big one, just sharp will be nice. And over here I have a pan where we're going to sit them at the end of it and let them rest until we're ready to cook them, or we'll put them in the freezer. So, first thing you're going to do, as I mentioned before, there's a three-step process. You first make a rope, you then cut the rope into size, and then we do what's called opening the gnocchis. So, first case, we're going to just take a little ball of the dough, maybe the size of a small apple, and we're going to work it in our hands a little just to get it moving. And what I like to do is start by just up and down, rolling it into a little bit of a log to get us started. Once we do that, as you can see, it's started. It's pretty thick. We want this to end up into a nice long rope, about the thickness of your finger, and then we're going to cut to size from there. So to get that nice and even and stretched out, what we're going to do is use our hands to roll. We just apply some pressure, and as we do, you'll notice I'm stretching out using my fingers to help. We just stretch out and pull as we're rolling. You don't have to worry too much. Don't overthink it. People like to overthink things in the kitchen. That's what gets you in trouble all the time. Just roll. You've probably played with Play-Doh before when you were a kid. It's no different than that. And what you're going to end up with is this rope, like I said, about the thickness of a finger. It might have some spots that are a little thinner than others. That's okay. Doesn't have to be perfect. We can account for that by how large of a piece we cut. Okay? So there's one. Let me show you again. We're going to take a little ball of dough about the size of a small apple. We're going to start getting that all together. I'm going to mix it in my hands here, roll it back and forth to get that rope started. Put it on our table. Now you'll see here I'm using a stainless steel table. I don't have any flour or any cutting board. At home you can use what you want. If you have a Formica or a granite top, you could certainly use that. You may find if it starts to stick, just take a little bit of the flour, not much, because then it will slide on you, and just roll up into it just a bit to grab a little bit of that flour to help you along and get rid of the stickiness without actually incorporating too much in the dough, because that will make them a little harder. Okay? So as you can see, I'm just taking them, not even really thinking about it. Just making a little rope out of each piece. So there you go. We'll move it there. We'll do one more, and then I'll show you the steps 2 and 3. We get that moving. We get it started. We roll it out using our hands and the pressure on our palms to elongate that rope to the thickness we're looking for. See, and it only takes a few seconds each. It's not a difficult process by any stretch. The hard part's coming up here in just a second. All right, so now is the hard part. It's not that hard, but some people it can be tricky. The next step is cutting them to size. I like the gnocchis a little bit on the smaller side. So we take these ropes, here, let me go this way so you might see it a little bit better. And we take it and we cut into about 1-inch pieces. That's what this knife is for. Now, remember I told you if it's a little thicker in one spot or thinner in one spot, you don't have to worry too much about it. Well, that's because if you have a piece of the rope that's thicker, just make a little bit smaller of a cut. And that way, ultimately, they'll all be right around the same size. And that helps them all cook more evenly and at the same time, etc. Which is true for just about anything you're cooking. So you'll cut all of the gnocchis up like that into size, and then you'll do the final step, which is called opening them. And here is the part that takes some practice. What you're going to do is take each little piece of gnocchi dough, put it on your board or your table, and you're going to take 2 fingers. Now, you may have seen people do this with their thumb. You might have seen people do this with a fork along a wooden, it's kind of like a grooved wooden spatula. I don't do any of that. I just do them how I learned. The way I learned was you take your 2 fingers, and because they're uneven, you're actually going to end up with a little bit of a bend in one of them. You start at the very top of the gnocchi, and you try to keep them upright as best you can. Don't come down like that. Try to keep your fingers upright. And what you're going to do is you're going to roll with pretty significant pressure right through the gnocchi. Now, you might even end up, as you can see, or might be able to see here, it ends up on the table a bit. Just kind of loosen that up with your hands. And what you have is you have an opening in the gnocchis that makes them lighter. It catches some of the sauce, and it's just the right way to do them. So here we are. We're going to do it again. Keep your fingers up, apply the pressure, roll right through. And one more. Now, as you do this, you'll get a lot quicker, and you'll be able to do them with both hands. You'll see on doing like this. You should have seen my grandmother when she would do them. They would be flying everywhere and end up in a nice, neat little pile right here. I'm not that good. Maybe you'll get there somehow. So what I'm going to do after I make all these gnocchis and open them is I like to put them on a sheet pan. Really not a need to put anything on it. You could put a little flour if you'd like to, or if some people use cornmeal. What we're going to do is lay them in a single layer on the pan. And then we're going to pop them in the freezer, or we would pop them in the freezer if I wasn't cooking them very soon. If you're not going to cook these within an hour or 2, then I would recommend you get them into the freezer. Because what happens with gnocchis as they sit is the moisture starts to ooze out and they become gummy, especially if you're doing potato gnocchis. If you aren't going to use them, therefore, you can pop them in the freezer. That's what we do here at the restaurant. We make a bunch ahead of time, of course. We put them in the freezer, and we go right from the freezer, the size of the portion you want, into the boiling water. They're nice and fresh and perfect. So I'm going to continue to roll these out, and then I'm going to show you how we cook them, and then we're going to taste everything we've made today. Okay, so now the only thing left to do is to cook these gnocchis, and then, of course, to eat them. So to cook them, we just have some water, nice amount of water. You don't want to crowd them, of course. Boiling water. And we have our gnocchis here on the pan as we let them rest. And what we're going to do is we're just going to drop them into the water. And you want to be careful with them because you don't want them to squish and you don't want to burn yourself. So and they really don't take very long to cook at all. You'll know they're done when they've risen to the top. So we're going to put that aside. I'm actually going to take my sauce spoon here and give them a little stir. Probably take about 3 minutes or so. And while that's cooking, I'm going to share with you some information. I don't know if you remember at the beginning of the show, I talked about the folklore behind cooking and the history of different ingredients, etc. And that, to me, is one of my favorite things about cooking, is learning these little bits of information. So I'm going to teach you, or tell you, I should say, a few things about gnocchi that you probably didn't know that I find rather interesting. First of all, the word. Gnocchi they're small dumplings, as you can tell, and it's one of the oldest preparations in the history of food. It recorded as far back in cookbooks of the 13th century. So this is a pretty old type food we're dealing with here. Gnocco is Italian slang for stupid person or dense. Now, gnocchi is the plural of that. I'm not sure why they did that, but that's the case. But I also found out that gnocchi means little lump, because essentially that's what they are. So somewhere in between dense people and little lumps, that's where we get gnocchis. But one of the folklores around, or bits of folklore around gnocchis, I found very interesting. And there's a chef named Norm Van Aken who had written some things on the internet. And he told us that in South America, there's a very curious tradition, at least in Uruguay and Argentina. And what they do is they believe on the 29th, if you eat gnocchi on the 29th of each month, you will have enough money for the next 30 days. So you can see, if you go to Uruguay and Argentina, you happen to be there on the 29th of the month, order gnocchis. You'll see that some people even place their wallets on their laps or put a few dollar bills under their plate just to help those spirits along, I guess. But gnocchi on the 29th of the month, I don't believe it's the 29th when this is going to be shown. But if it is, go home, make some, and in fact, enjoy 30 days of worry-free finances. So there you go. Really interesting stuff, I think. Okay, so we've only talked about, just for a short period of time, the gnocchis have already risen. And now what I'm going to do, you can throw these in a colander if you'd like, or you could just take a strainer and just reach right in your pan, let them drain a bit, and we'll put them right into the dish. All right, I'll just add a few more there. That works. And now we're going to add some sauce to that and grab a few meatballs. Our sauce is looking good here. The meatballs all cooked through. I'm going to take a couple of meatballs. Notice they're still round and whole because of the frying we did for them and because of the way that we applied that pressure and rolled them properly. Take a little bit of a ladle with some of this sauce in it. Put it over the gnocchis. Now, what you may know or not know is that gnocchis were traditionally eaten with a different sauce. They were not eaten with the marinara sauce or a red sauce, whatever you'd like to call it. They are often eaten with a brown butter and sage sauce. But you'll have to come to my cooking class to learn how to make that one. Today, we're going to make it like so many other people enjoy, which is simply with pasta with meatballs and sauce, like every other. You could put a little cheese on it or not, it's up to you. Then we're just going to take a nice little bite here, very hot, be careful. And truly, perfect. The texture, like I said, if you've ever had gnocchi, potato gnocchis, these are really entirely different. And the flavor is wonderful, the texture, it's got a nice little bite to it. And I believe you really, really enjoy these. One more. And then let's try our meatballs. Cut those in half. They're very soft. If you remember, if you use the wet bread, you'll even have them a little softer. We use the breadcrumbs, but they work nicely. Just try a little bite of that. Soft, all those flavors from the spices are in there. You can taste a little bit of that garlic. It's perfect. So there you go. We've gone from Graham's meat sauce and meatballs to her gnocchis. It really is an easy process, one I hope you do try at home. But when you do, remember, if you're going to cook, cook with love, because you'll taste the difference.